A victim went before a judge to request an order of protection because she felt she and her children were in danger from her ex-husband who was stalking her and threatening to kill her. The judge granted the order of protection. However, as the defendant and the victim were leaving the courtroom, the judge said to the offender, "I suggest you send her flowers and candy and try to win her back. You just need to iron out your little misunderstandings and then go back to being a family again." Obviously, that judge didn't have a clue about domestic violence and the kind of terror that victims live with. This is a story about hope, about how a small group of people stayed with their conviction and influenced an entire community to change the way they are responding to domestic violence.
How we began this process in Nashville is we had a few people who were really committed leaders who wanted to make this dream happen. And so they kept pushing the system. And I call it gentle pressure relentlessly applied, pushing and pushing until the system was ready to respond.
You have got to be committed to change, because this is about change. This is about a cultural change, because we have not treated women and children in this country fairly when it comes to this issue of domestic violence. And we're beginning to know that, and we're beginning to learn it. That the shelter movement around the country and the women who work in these shelters have taught us lessons about this, that all victims of domestic violence want is the law to keep its promise, and it hasn't done that. But I think now, with all these collaborative efforts in government, especially here in Nashville, the law is beginning to keep its promise.
The people who eventually pulled this together, it was not the chief executive of the city, and it's not the governor, and it's not the county executive. It was people like a sergeant in the police force, people like a victim witness coordinator in the district attorney's office, because they stayed with it day after day after day after day, and finally gathered enough people and enough interest together that it did capture the imagination of the leadership.
Originally, when Nashville looked at setting up their coordinated community approach, they actually went to Gallatin and visited Judge Wheatcraft, her court, and saw what she had done, because she was truly a pioneer in this community effort.
The strength of a community is dependent upon the vision of its leaders, whose ultimate responsibility is the welfare of the people.
I felt that the system as a whole needed to better respond to the needs of the victim, and I took a leadership role in that regard, and I think that's critical. And what's critical is that the community, and that includes the perpetrators, the victims, the police officers, all know that the court system is going to stand firm.
It's something you can do something about. There are so many kinds of crime that go on in the community that you're very hard-pressed to know what to do besides adding a few police officers or something. And domestic violence is something where we know what we can do to make a difference. And that's rare enough in government. You ought to seize the opportunity when it comes.
Domestic violence is second only to larceny as the most committed crime in our nation. Nashville's domestic violence police unit of 33 dedicated personnel, the largest in the country, has seen a 50% reduction in their domestic homicide rate since the inception of the unit in 1994. Take a look at the number of homicides in your town or city that are domestic related. It will most likely be a very high percentage, but that number can be reduced drastically.
All the experts in the country who've taught homicide prevention and homicide investigation, one of the first things they'll say is murder is the only crime you can't prevent. Well, that's just not true. Because if you identify domestic violence and identify domestic murder as a problem, you begin to look at those murders and you begin to do a fatality review on those cases, and what you find out is the police have probably been to that house 3 or 4 or 5 times before the murder. Or the victim has called the shelter 3 or 4 or 5 times before the murder. or the victim has been to a court 3 or 4 or 5 times before the murder, or the victim has talked to their minister 3 or 4 times before the murder. So there's usually some outreach from a victim. And if you look at it that way, those are all opportunities for the government, for the community, to intervene for a victim long before they become a murder victim. So when I hear people say murder is unpreventable, I say you just don't understand domestic violence.
I thought this unit was going to provide an opportunity to actually treat domestic violence as a crime as opposed to just a family matter or a simple call for patrol, where we could actually take the call and work the call all the way through and investigate it like you would anything else, a car theft or a robbery or anything else, and actually be able to really get involved in it and make a difference in that.
When you go on a call, maybe the woman is afraid to prosecute, but if there's evidence there and we see, even though she says, oh no, then we can prosecute, which takes her off the hook. And because she's afraid, well, I've got to live with this man next week, so I better not have him arrested. But we can do that, and that gets the message over that we're not going to tolerate violence in the home.
Here's an opportunity for police, especially, to lower those overall numbers of reoccurring violence and recidivism by solving the problem the first time they go out, instead of halfway answering a call because they're frustrated or the victims are reluctant to cooperate. And there's a lot of other things that go along with that. But here's a real chance for us to do the right thing the first time so we can prevent murder. And that's what I call preventative law enforcement, just doing the right thing. And the victims will tell you all they want is to feel free and safe to sleep in their beds at night and not worry about death.
When you can make somebody feel comfortable enough to come out and talk to you about the situation and find some solutions to the problems, it sort of makes you feel good, especially if you have a situation where the person is really seriously in danger of being seriously hurt or killed. And if you can keep that person alive, it feels great. There's no explanation about how you can feel to explain how you feel when you feel that you saved someone's life. It's amazing.
The judges in Nashville are doing their jobs. When a person is found guilty of a crime by the courts, pleads guilty of that crime, then that person must be held accountable for their actions.
If you go into a bank robbery, you don't go up to the teller and say, if we catch the robber, do you want us to prosecute? They prosecute a bank robbery. Why not prosecute a domestic violence offense? If you go in, don't ask the victim. Investigate the crime that it is. Through your investigation, gather all the evidence and come to court and prosecute.
You have to think of prosecution of domestic violence as a prosecution at best without a victim, similar to a murder case, where you have to be able to prove from other sources than from the mouth of the victim what happened. So we heavily rely on 911 tapes and photographs. If we have any witnesses, neighbors, children, we try to use those witnesses as well. It's just a different way of looking at a criminal case.
Judges do not understand the dynamics of domestic violence. First of all, judges don't understand what it is to be powerless. They don't understand the feelings that these victims have of, that they can't perhaps make it on their own, that they're economically tied, they're emotionally tied to the perpetrator. And I think too often judges say, why don't you just leave? That's the response. If this is bad, just get away from him. But it's just not that simple. Judges have got to educate themselves on the whole dynamic of domestic violence.
Collaboration is probably the most important thing that Nashville is doing. One prosecutor, one victim witness advocate, one police officer cannot make a difference. But when the departments are talking between themselves, and also including outside community agencies that usually don't have a say-so in the prosecution of a case, you can have success.
If an individual was given a chance to do treatment and then report back to the court periodically on status checks, if this individual comes to court and has not been in treatment, has missed an extensive amount, then Judge Robinson will put them in jail right there on the spot. in front of a courtroom full of people, and it really does get the attention of those that are waiting to enter their pleas. And their attitude is a lot different when they come back to be interviewed by probation, because they understand that it's a serious matter and the court is going to hold them accountable.
The frustrating thing for an attorney is having a victim saying, I don't want to prosecute, don't send him to jail, when that's all the district attorney does. You work on the case and leave the victim out of the process. You let the people who should deal with victims deal with the victims, the victim witness advocate, the people at the shelter.
The more contact we have with victims, the more options we give them. The more assistance we offer them, the more we empower them. The support system becomes the ladder victims climb that takes them out of the cycle of domestic violence.
5 years ago, we were lucky if we got in touch with and spoke to 20% of victims whose cases were coming to court. And now we speak to almost 70 to 75% of the victims who have pending court cases. And just by the fact that we are speaking to them now, it means they're getting information, they're getting support, they're getting referral to other services, they're getting good information about what domestic violence prosecution is in general and what it's going to be in their case. As far as their case goes, they understand the system better, hopefully therefore less intimidated by it.
Every woman needs a place for her and her children to go when she can't get no help. I didn't have it at the beginning. I didn't have help. I was not supported by no one, but just me and my children. And the shelter really took a great part in my life and helped me through it all.
I think as we continue to raise community awareness about domestic violence, that two things happen. One is that we get more victims needing shelter and wanting to come to shelter. And two is we begin to run out of space to put those victims. And so I think another key role as you are developing your community-wide approach is you have to anticipate that once you start doing a better job of providing these services in the community, that you're going to increase your need for that service. And so your shelter program is going to need to grow with that increase.
Two things must happen to have a successful batterers treatment program. Batterers must be held accountable for their actions, and there must be consequences if they do not attend the program.
I went before the judge, and the judge asked me if I had indeed touched her or hit her. I said yes, and just the system started working right then and there. I was booked and then released on bond that night. And I came back about a month later for my trial and was sentenced to 11 months, 29 days probation and a 26-week peace program, mandatory peace program.
Since the formation of the Domestic Violence Unit, we've seen a lot of changes at peace, and primarily it has to do with clients taking the program seriously, and that means clients attending group and clients knowing that if they don't attend group there will be a consequence, and hence the graduation rate has increased, and we feel that if we have a client actually attending and coming consistently, then obviously we're going to be able to teach him tools to replace old behaviors with new behaviors.
You have to admit it to yourself, and you have to be accountable. You have to be honest and actually want to change and be a better person. And the techniques are out there, and they will be taught to you. But deep down inside, you have to know that you've done wrong, and it's not acceptable. It won't be tolerated in no place. And you have to want to change.
I think it's important that you look at each case individually, because there are some people, and I could usually tell them who they were, who I could tell were not going to respond to a treatment program. There are some people that simply have to go to jail.
The ultimate goal of Nashville's domestic violence policy is to break the cycle so we're not passing this legacy on to our children. More efforts in the future will focus on counseling and support services for children and their families.
I was creating in my son something that was created from watching my parents. I was the only one that could break that cycle.
Most domestic violence occurs in front of children, and it's traumatizing to them, but even more significantly, I think, is that they grow up. We're raising another generation of children who think that this is the way you handle problems. So I think that getting counseling for these children is absolutely critical, because at some point they have to be taught that this is not the way that you deal with problems. It's not the way you deal with someone you love.
We all know there are no quick fixes to ending domestic violence, but in Nashville, we have discovered a community must have 5 key elements, 5 seeds of change to begin to stop this war at home. Number 1, a commitment to change. Number 2, a domestic violence task force, a coalition. Number 3, strong leadership. Number 4, mandatory training and policy for everyone in the system. Number 5, ongoing evaluation. These seeds of change planted today will be tomorrow's harvest.
I'd say to any community that says, I don't have the money, that it's a matter of priorities. We do spend money on various things in law enforcement. This is an area where you can get immediate, quantifiable results, and I think it ought to be a priority in your community.
I've heard all the excuses in the world. I've heard everything from we don't have the money, that we don't have the manpower, we can't dedicate this resource or that resource. But if you look at domestic violence the way it should be looked at, holistically, we're talking about a crime that produces criminals. We're talking about a crime that is the root of most of the crime that we deal with today. And if we in government truly want to stop crime today and 20 years from today, we've got to get to the root of it. And this is the way to stop future murder. This is the way to stop future assaults on police officers. This is the way to stop future bank robbers, because all those violent criminals are born and trained in the homes filled with domestic violence. So if you look at it that way, this is the best way and the best hope to reducing violent crimes 20 years from today.